Good morning. So you've heard from that great presentation this morning about some big data and how it can be used to predict performance. Well, this is a bit of a story about one particular type of forecast, and actually the problem is very small data. So this morning I'm just going to talk you through a few points, but overall I'm going to tell you about the challenge that we faced in the hospital I work in London, about the methods that I had to develop to try to meet that challenge, and I hope I can convince you that they're sound methods. And we're going to talk a little bit about the indications of that, what happens next, and what were the indications in that specific case. But I thought I'd actually take the opportunity to introduce myself in the interest of connecting with you all. I started off with an MEng working in mechanical engineering and engineering for the life sciences, and like many here, I wanted to explore engineering for philanthropic purposes. I got involved with a charity and worked in Honduras for a couple of months, and that gave me some exposure to clinical engineering issues. And then I started a graduate scheme in the UK NHS on training clinical scientists. And after that, started working at Guy's and St Thomas's, that's a view from the hospital. And at the same time, I did a PhD, which in short was about exploring how we actually achieve value through clinical engineering. So in line with what was said earlier on, how do we achieve those patient outcomes with our decisions? And my line manager recognized that I could juggle work and some research and asked me to start on a new course called a DClinSci, which is in the UK to develop senior clinical scientists. The project I'm telling you about is part of that work there. So if you don't work in anything to do with radiology or you haven't had much contact, an X-ray tube is a light bulb, and it produces the light that we use for imaging in X-rays and CTs. And like a light bulb, they go bang sometimes, and unlike a light bulb, they can cost between 20 and 110,000 pounds when they go bang, including some costly downtime. And so in 2014, at Guy's and St Thomas's, sorry, these values should be 450,000 and 525,000. In the previous year, there had been a huge spend on replacing X-ray tubes and detectors. And this is just a tongue-in-cheek caricature. We work with industry, but we were offered a deal that in the next year and in the years after that, if you give a down payment, they would double the down payment to cover the costs of these failures. So in those circumstances, what do you do? The solution, of course, is to try to predict which X-ray tubes would fail within the next year and then select that optimum level of cover so that we could save money. So the research question became, can our data support the selection of contracts to maximize savings? But of course, I was interested in forecasting performance for broader applications. And when you're dealing with data, sometimes it's messy. Our inventory had some of that. Also had to look at procurement records and audit records from a radiation safety team to understand which X-ray tubes had failed historically and when, very accurately. Tried to look at this failure data and model survival characteristics using some previous methods, mining service records that were coded and attempting to build models of how different categories worked. But that had worked before when I had 150,000 work records to use. But in this case, there's just too much variation between scanners. They're used at different amounts. They're used for different modalities. A mammogram is quite different from a fluoroscopy scan. And then you consider the inherent variation in construction. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier, the cost varies hugely. So it makes the forecast quite complicated. And the general challenge, I'd say, is that the more specific your forecast, if you want to forecast the failure of a particular device, you're going to have much less data to work with for that device. So the analysis I found was not fit for purpose. The forecasts were way too high level. So we had to look at the methods. First of all, thought about improving the response variable. Instead of thinking about the time in between failures, thought we wanted to incorporate the frequency of use. So that meant getting data from our radiological information system, so we could sort of model number of uses before failure. We didn't have access to actual scanner utilization data from these particular scanners. But better still, there's a measure called workload, which for X-ray tubes is a measure of the current that's flowing through them, the time integral of the current, and it measures their usage. And using certain standards, you could work out that a fluoroscopy scan had a certain workload and so on. And that number is proportional to the number of electrodes striking the anode target within the X-ray tube. By using that as the response variable instead of time, we could consider data from different scanners and compare that and aggregate those to make better predictions. But it still didn't account for other sorts of uncertainty. So if you're familiar with machine learning, you might be familiar with Reverend Thomas Bayes. And quite honestly, the theory that he proposed was that we can think of all of our decision making, our decision support, as being based on belief. And using conditional probability, you can combine evidence on the basis of a belief model. And you can actually frame lots of machine learning techniques, artificial intelligence, within this expression here. But broadly speaking, it's about integrating evidence and pulling it together to inform belief and inform decisions. And I wanted to understand how, across this hierarchy of different scanners, just showing us subsets, it's a bit biased towards certain suppliers, how I can predict the tube performance in this particular scanner, perhaps starting off with the data from all the scanners together. So what ensued was it's a novel, hierarchically structured survival analysis, and there are some models which kind of look at this to start off with, random effects models, for example, but the closest is called hierarchical Bayes, but it requires some initial knowledge of how the data performs, what the behavior of the X-ray tubes is. In this novel analysis, it would be completely agnostic of that. It would observe the data and it would inform predictions. So to try to explain that, it's really starting at the top here. The analysis stops and says, I know about the behavior of all scanners because I have all the data here. How do I think the tubes will perform? And then successively it moves down the detail hierarchy to say, well, what about mobiles within that? Some of that data was mobiles. If I want to predict for a mobile scanner, things behave in a certain way, and so on, right down to the individual device level, which has its own failure characteristic. So it uses all the available data to make the most specific forecast and quantifies uncertainty while it does it. And I won't explain the terms of this, but this is a Weibull model based on Bayes' theorem. And in particular, just to point out that the key innovation here is being able to look at the relevance of a hierarchical categorization. So how relevant is it that it is a mobile scanner versus another type of scanner? And so based on that, I could produce failure characteristics for each X-ray tube and also for detectors that didn't perform so well. And that could be used to support decision making. So back to our decision. The company had suggested we take out £190,000 cover per year for 5 years. And in year one, the prediction was that the 84% chance would mean a huge overspend. And actually it was quite nervous because it was closer to £50,000. And so we made a decision and we used these probability distributions that we generated and actually found that performance was quite good, much more than you'd expect from when you have only 2 or 3 failures historically for each individual scanner. And so to summarize that graph, there were £230,000 of savings made over 3 years versus that recommendation. And actually in 2017-18, the forecast was within £1,000 of the actual cost in the year, which is remarkable when the cheapest X-ray tube is £20,000. 40% saving over the 3 years. But it's important to note that for detectors, last year, there was a huge spend that was bigger than anything that could be predicted because there's more of a human factor there. Unlike X-ray tubes, someone could drop a digital radiography plate, and one particular department dropped 2 of those. So it actually pointed us towards a human factors issue there. But the analysis, if you exclude the detectors, still performed very well. And so it actually points towards structuring deals differently. So back to that question, can our data support these kinds of decisions? And I would say yes, it's been demonstrated that it's possible. And where might we go with this next? The more data you have, the more powerful the analysis. And this hierarchical way of looking at things means that you can actually think about how do scanners in a country, in the world, in the continent, in a country, in a city, in a region, in a hospital, in a department, how can you aggregate data across centres? But projects that might be interesting, other contracts would be thinking small, other decisions, looking at the actual terminal failure of devices, and clinical applications. Epidemiological data, looking at cancer prognosis for different substrata of the population. This kind of analysis can actually be used in that way. And it starts with medical devices, but it could be, for example, used to inform how we set up screening programs for certain cancers. So there's lots of scope for development. So I hope I've convinced you that the challenge is worthwhile. This was about cost initially, but it could be much more. I hope I've convinced you that methods are at least interesting, if not sound, and that the indications are that this work should go forwards. But if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to take those now or later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. We do have time for questions. And we have a microphone available. Yeah, sure. There's questions over here in the middle.
Excellent speech. Congrats. I'd like to know your insights about one of the factors for the future, the present and the future, which is the collection of evidences. It's clear that the inventory, in this case, of evidences is key, not only for the development, but for the sustainability of your amazing method. What are your insights about this? And thinking about your vision, not only for an apartment, but for other countries as well, and think about countries in which the inventory of the equipment is just a challenge. No? Some insights about this evidences collection of data.
Okay. So I've understood that it's a question about about perhaps using these methods, perhaps even in the real world data. So actually using work records is something that many of us do. We've followed in the footsteps of leaders in doing that. That's something that, for example, in health technology assessment, in certain practices of that, it happens before something gets onto the market. Actually, by using these kinds of analysis, we can understand how devices are performing in life. Also, when you look at systems like that in the previous presentation. So this analysis can help us to deal with the messy and unstructured data and pull some insights for it to inform better decisions. I hope that answers the question.
We do have time for another question. And any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. Could you explain a little more why the technique was a little less successful with detectors than it was with tubes?
Yes, that's it. Yeah. So all of that work with looking at the response variables was really about understanding that process of failure, and it's a degradation type failure. The models that I was using, the survival models, model those quite well. But when it comes to use errors, it's very difficult to predict when a person is going to drop a detector that costs £50,000. And so what tended to come from that is actually we shouldn't be analysing it in that way. It might not be fit for purpose, but there's another indication, and that is perhaps we need to take that out of that deal, the detectors, and deal with those in a different way. It might be due to ensure a more of a formal insurance purpose. So in that case, actually the analysis was useful in highlighting that the department is the dependency there, but we probably could have noticed that anyway from looking at the data. But it's just nowhere near the performance with the X-ray tubes. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.